Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy human being you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's true crime video. I'm so happy we could meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this that we're forced to deal with on the day-to-day, today you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the tragic murder of the Prince of Soul, Marvin Gaye. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, and sometimes it's 2 a week like this week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us, one of us, one of us. Now, before we get into the details of today's case, I first need to say a big thank you to the sponsor of today's video, and that is Aura. I want to start this off with a question for you. And the question is this: have you ever Googled your name or the name of somebody you know and been surprised to see yours or their information on one of those public listing sites? I'm sure you have, and that's because it's far more common for your personal information to get leaked on the web than you might think. And that is because there are these people, these things called data brokers, and data brokers are out there taking your information and selling your information and making so much money. Okay, and they're giving your information to people you do not want to have it, like robocallers and spammers, and they can even find out where you live. They can get your home address, and I am not down with that sickness, and I can't imagine that you're down with that sickness. I value my privacy and your privacy, and that's why I want to introduce you to Aura. Now, did you know that data brokers are legally required to remove your information if you ask them? That sounds great, right? Well, it is too good to be true because they make it almost impossible for you to do so. And the biggest issue is finding out which data brokers actually have your information so that you can ask them to stop selling your information. And that's where Aura comes in. Aura identifies which pesky data brokers have your information and they submit opt-out requests on your behalf. They do the work so that you do not have to. When I signed up for Aura, the very first thing I did is I went to the data broker opt-out section, and I was like, I'm just kind of curious how many of these data brokers actually have my information. And it was like 30. And I found that when I logged in, Aura had already submitted opt-out requests on my behalf. And on top of that, Aura checks to see if your information's been leaked on the dark web. And nobody wants to have their information linked on the dark web. And they test to see if the passwords that you've chosen for like important sites that you don't want people to be able to get into, they check to see if your passwords are strong. And I checked, and my passwords, surprisingly considering I've had the same password since like 2007, are still very strong. I got it right the first time, what can I say? I do good stuff. And those are just a couple of things, a couple of ways that Aura keeps you and your family safe online from threats that you can't even see. Through just the Aura app, which is super easy to set up, by the way, you can get things like parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, identity theft insurance, and more. And you get it all in one place without having to get several apps, a different app for each thing, and you get it all at one affordable price. It sounds like a great deal to me, and listen, I'm not your mom, I can't tell you what to do, but what I can tell you is that I don't want people to freaking exploit you and profit off of your private information, and you don't have to. You can let Aura do the hard work for you by protecting you online, and of course, I've got good news for you today, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about this right now. Aura is offering members of the Brat Pack the opportunity to peruse, to explore all they have to offer for 14 days for free through my link. So if all that sounds as good to you as it does to me, make sure to go to aura.com/Bratterstein and get a 14-day free trial and find out if anyone out there is profiting and using your personal information, or if your personal information has been leaked online. And if it has, let Aura help you put a stop to it today. Now I just want to say a big thank you to Aura for partnering with me on today's video. It's sponsors like Aura that make it possible for me to put out videos as consistently as I do. And a big thank you to you guys for always being so supportive of all of my sponsors. You rock. Don't ever change. Alright, now that I'm done begging you to join my cult, we can go ahead and get into this video. Now you may notice that this video is a little bit shorter than my other videos. Friday videos tend to be on the shorter side, but don't you worry. If you're still into long videos, if you like deep dives, multi-parters, all that jazz, Mondays are reserved for you. That's where I'm still putting up a video every single Monday that is usually an hour or more in time. I'm just going to go with that sentence. It sounds good to me. So now I'm going to tell you the story about the life and the murder of Marvin Gaye. And at the end of this video, I want you to answer a question of the day. I'm going to give it to you now so you can have it kicking around in your brain as we go through the details, but obviously I want you to answer it when you have some information to go on. But the question of the day is this: do you believe that Marvin Gaye provoked his murderer in order to help him end his own life? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below after we go through the details of this case. And now with all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the murder of Marvin Gaye, the Prince of Soul. On April 1st, 1984, police responded to a call that led them to a home in Los Angeles, California. When they arrived at this home, they found that a man, this was 69-year-old Marvin Gaye Sr., was sitting calmly on the front porch. But once they entered the home and they went into one of the bedrooms of the house, they found that this man's son, 44-year-old Marvin Gaye Jr., was suffering from gunshot wounds. And so he was rushed to the hospital, obviously, because they were hoping that they'd be able to save his life, but unfortunately, he was pronounced dead on arrival. Marvin Gaye had been shot twice, and the first bullet had been fatal. Because of the position that Marvin was in when he was shot, the first bullet had pierced his left kidney, his stomach, his liver, his lung, and his heart, and then the second bullet that entered him just went through his shoulder. When the news first started coming out that Marvin Gaye had been killed, at first, people actually didn't believe it. They thought that it was a joke. They thought it was a hoax because it was April 1st, April Fool's Day after all. But as more and more reports started coming out, and it started coming out that Marvin Gaye Jr. was murdered and that his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., was responsible, people started to realize that it was true. The Prince of Soul was dead, and his father had murdered him. Now, let's talk about Marvin a little bit and his father so we can understand how we ended up at this place. Marvin Pence Gaye Jr., who was actually born, so his name, Marvin Gaye, spelled like this. I'm going to put it on the screen. He actually was born Marvin Gaye with no E at the end of his name, but when he went into performing later, he changed his stage name to Marvin Gaye with an E, which we'll get into a little bit more later, but I just wanted to clarify that now. But Marvin Pence Gaye Jr. was born on April 2nd, 1939, and he was born in Washington, D.C. to his parents, Alberta, who was a social worker and a maid, and his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., who was a preacher. Marvin was the second of 4 children born to his parents. He had an older sister, and then he had a younger sister and a younger brother. Marvin also had an older brother who Alberta, his mother, had actually given birth to shortly before she met and married Marvin Sr. in 1935, which this is so messed up. But when Alberta and Marvin Sr. got married, Marvin Sr. told her, listen, I'm not going to raise some other man's child. So he actually had Alberta's first child, which is the oldest son, Marvin's oldest brother, sent to live with family, and that's where he grew up. And you know what? Speaking of other children who are out there that are related to Marvin Gaye, Alberta wasn't the only person who had a child, out of their relationship. Marvin Sr. had a son as well, but this son actually was conceived while he was married to Alberta because he was not faithful. Apparently he was known for being very unfaithful all the time, having numerous affairs. So there could be even more kids out there, but there was one son that was claimed, that was known to be his, that was born to another woman while he was married to Alberta. So, lots of kids. We already have some tension with him, sending her oldest son away and then going out and having affairs and getting other people pregnant. And this is the home that Marvin Gaye is being born into. Now, this was already a pretty large household, right? With 4 children to raise. That would already seem like a lot. But this family seemed even larger when you took into the fact that Marvin Sr. and Alberta just simply did not have the financial means to raise all of these children. Marvin Gaye and his siblings grew up in a very low income house, so low income that they didn't have electricity or running water at times. But, you hear about people all the time that come from homes that don't have a lot of money, you don't hear as many, at least I don't hear, well, I know, how do I word this properly? A lot of people grow up without money, right? A lot of us grow up poor. I grew up hella poor. But a lot of times these families have each other to lean on. Our love will keep us warm. We can do anything as long as we weather this storm together, right? You hear about that a lot. But that just really wasn't the case in Marvin Gaye's household. Now, as I said before, Marvin Gaye's father was a preacher, and I'm now going to expand on that a little bit because it does matter. So he was a preacher at a Hebrew Pentecostal church called the House of God, and he had been a part of this church and belief system for a very long time. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole belief system of the Pentecostal faith, but it is a bit more strict than traditional Christianity. For example, particularly with women. Women are to wear like long dresses that go all the way down to their ankles and long sleeves that go down to their wrists. You're not supposed to watch TV. You're not supposed to listen to the radio. Girls are not supposed to wear open-toed shoes or makeup, things like that. Now, I know for a fact there are people out there that are going to know way more about the intricate specifics of the Pentecostal faith, but I'm not completely talking out of my ass because I did have a little bit of introduction to this in my life. I had an uncle and aunt and cousins who are Pentecostal, and the conversation definitely came up. Like, I got to hear a little bit here, a little bit there when we'd have family gatherings. Like, me and my sisters were allowed to watch cartoons and my cousins were not, but like, that's as much as I really know. So if you are Pentecostal yourself, you're honestly probably not watching this video, but if you have more information on that and you want to put it in the comment section so we can all learn, feel free to do so. Anyways, in addition to, no TV, girls wearing long sleeves, there was another thing in the belief system that Marvin Gaye Sr. held, and that was that his wife's role was to be a supporter of the leader of the household. And that was the husband, that was Marvin Gaye Sr., and his children were to be obedient. This was what he believed, this was the belief system he had, and he said that his family, his wife, his kids needed to follow that. And when they did not, when his kids, when his wife failed to live up to the expectations he had, were not obedient to him, they were subjected to abuse, both physical abuse and verbal abuse. So, okay, for example, Marvin Sr., Papa Marvin, raised his kids so deep in their religion, like they were observing extended Sabbath on Saturdays and all that jazz. And he would actually go as far as quizzing his kids on biblical passages. And if they got the questions wrong, he would beat his kids. He would even starve his kids because he believed that the hunger would bring them closer to God. Marvin Gaye later said of his father, and I quote, "Living with a father was like living with a king, an all-cruel, changeable, cruel, and all-powerful king." Now, even though Alberta and all of the kids received, their fair share of abuse, nobody received quite as much as Marvin Jr. Like, for whatever reason, Marvin Sr. really just did not care for him. And even Marvin's sister said that Marvin Jr. really received like the bulk of his rage and got the worst whippings. Apparently, Marvin Sr. often told his son, like, "I brought you into this world, and if you cross me, I will take you out." He just didn't like his eldest son. Like, for whatever reason, he didn't like his eldest son, the child that was literally named after him. Alberta has come out since and said, like, he never wanted Marvin. He never even liked Marvin, and for some reason, she doesn't know why, he never even loved his child. She said what made the situation worse is that he didn't want her to love Marvin. He didn't want her to love her own son, but she did. She loved him so much. Apparently, her and Marvin Jr. had a super close relationship, which probably, didn't make Papa Gaye very happy since he was so vocal and open about disliking his son. Alberta said that throughout Marvin's life, Marvin Sr. would just say, like, he knew Marvin wasn't his kid. He would deny him, say that he wasn't his son. And Alberta would tell him, like, that was nonsense. And she knew that deep down he knew that it was his child. He just didn't love him for some reason. And she said, and this is really sad, she said that from a young age, when Marvin Gaye was just a little boy, he knew his father didn't love him. Like, okay, Marvin Sr. was asked after Marvin Gaye died, after he had murdered his child, they asked him, like, "Did you ever love your son?" And he answered with, quote, "Let's say I didn't dislike him." That's so sad to me, dude. Now, when Marvin was little, his father played piano at church. And even though Marvin Jr., feared his father and didn't like him very much, he did still seem like he wanted his approval. He wanted to please him. So when his father would play piano, he actually started going to the church. Well, he had already gone to the church, but he started singing choir in the church. And that's actually where his love of music began. He would sing, his father would play piano, and eventually he actually taught himself to play piano as well. It was during this time that people really started to take notice of Marvin and how good of a singer he was. He was very well known at that time in the area for being great, and people just saw him as like a natural talent. But as his skills, his natural abilities became more and more apparent, his father refused to see it, refused to acknowledge it, and refused to support it. But his mother did. His mother was incredibly supportive of his musical career, and Marvin came out later when he was an adult, and he said, like, if his mother had not been there to support him in his journey through music, he may have taken his own life. And that probably has to do with the fact that his father told him over and over, like, you're never going to be anything, you're never going to amount to anything. This was his passion, his escape from a less than ideal home. And as he grew up, it didn't get any better. His home life just didn't get better. In his teenage years, the abuse got so bad that he would just not come home. He'd stay with friends for days at a time just to avoid his father. And then this would make his father even more mad. So when he did come home, it was just not a good experience. By 1956, Marvin Jr. was almost done with high school. He was like in his final years of high school, and he actually decided to drop out because he wanted to join in the Air Force. I guess his home life was so bad, he finally just had enough of it, and he just wanted to get as far away as possible. And by this time, his father had actually left the church. He had kind of lost his faith in the church, in God, and kind of in people just across the board. And he had actually turned to alcohol really aggressively. He couldn't hold down a job, was just always drinking and leaving all of the financial burden and responsibility on his wife's shoulders. And this was incredibly hard for her. So that's another reason that Marvin Jr. decided to leave. One, he wanted to get away. And two, he wanted to go and make something of himself so he had some money so he could help his mother support herself, and her husband. And this did work, by the way, later down the line, obviously, not immediately upon leaving and going into the Air Force. But once he made it in music, he did make enough to fulfill his dream of helping his mother. He bought his parents a big ass house in Los Angeles, and his mother was able to actually retire and just live there and be cool and be comfortable. So he got to do what he wanted to do, which is not something that all of us can do. Now, when he first joined the Air Force, he wanted to be a pilot, but it didn't take him long to realize that this wasn't really for him. I have to imagine that it probably reminded him too much of his father, like being screamed at and controlled really wasn't doing it for him like he thought it might. So he actually faked a mental illness so that he could be discharged from the Air Force. It was once returning home after being honorably discharged that Marvin Gaye really started to make his way and go down the path of music as a career. He ended up joining a vocal group and started getting work as a backup singer and a backup musician throughout the years, but didn't really find his own break for a while. But he had to put in his dues first. Eventually, though, he ended up getting a break when he signed with Tamla Motown, which was a record label founded by Berry Gordy. And this was huge because other artists who were attached to this label at the time were just some people that maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't. It was like the Supremes, and this is when Diana Ross was still included, Stevie Wonder, the Jackson 5, Smokey Robinson, Ryan Howard's all-time favorite musician, and now Marvin Gaye. It was around this time that Marvin Gaye added the E to the end of his last name, changing it from G-A-Y to G-A-Y-E. And he did this for a couple of reasons. The first of which was that, he wanted to separate himself from his father and, be his own person, all that, which totally makes sense considering the upbringing he had, and also just wanting to be your own person. I get it. But the other reason was that he wanted to make sure that nobody had any questions about his sexuality, because before that it had been just gay, which is I don't know, man. It was such a different time. I don't know. Maybe it's something I wouldn't have done. But apparently he had some insecurities around this already, because something about Marvin Gaye Sr. that is discussed a lot. People talk about it a lot. And it was something that made Marvin Gaye Jr. a little bit insecure, was that his father was said, across the board, in all articles, he was referred to as a cross-dresser, them saying that he liked to cross-dress, which is a term that just hits my ear wrong. I Googled it to see. I was like, is this the term? Because it makes me uncomfortable. For whatever reason, it just hits wrong. I don't know if it's offensive. Online it says it's not, but let me know, because I know you guys will. You guys are pretty good about that. Is there a term that is more widely accepted? Because for whatever reason, when I say it, I feel ick. And when I read it, I was like, that feels ick. But either way, Marvin Sr. would, cross-dress, and he had features that were seen as more femme, and he liked to accentuate that, and he liked to dress that way behind closed doors. And this is something that Marvin Jr. saw growing up and even adopted growing up. He and his father would both do this, and he said he wanted to make it clear that he and his father were not gay. They just liked to explore and express the feminine parts of themselves through dress from time to time. But then at the same time, he did change his name because he wanted to make sure everybody knew he was straight as hell, Marvin Gaye with an E. Now, the next several years were a whirlwind of upward momentum for Marvin Gaye and his career and like his life. It changed so much so fast. His career was taking off with him having several popular songs both as a solo artist and in duos. Today, Marvin Gaye is widely known as one of the most successful soul musicians of all time. He helped to, quote, shape the sound of the Motown in the 1960s, earning him the nickname, well, two nicknames, the Prince of Motown and the Prince of Soul. On top of having success in his career, he was also having a little bit of success in his love life because he had met and married his first wife. This was a woman named Anna Gordy. Now, you may recognize that last name, Gordy, because this was actually the sister of Berry Gordy, who was the founder of Motown, the label that he was attached to. So Anna was a bit older than Marvin when they met, but they really hit it off and they really liked each other. They dated, they got married, they were happy. They even went on to adopt a baby together, this little baby boy. I guess Anna's cousin, her young cousin, I think she was like 16 when she got pregnant, she had a child and they ended up adopting this child. It was a little baby boy and they ended up naming him Marvin and raising him as their own. But despite all that, it didn't take long for the relationship to start kind of going downhill because it turns out that Marvin sort of took after his father a little bit in that he liked to have multiple affairs with multiple women. There was even like a rumor, I don't think it's ever been proven, but there was a rumor that Marvin, the baby that they adopted, was actually his baby, that he had gotten her 16-year-old niece pregnant. I don't know if there's any truth to that. I didn't see online that it was ever proven, but this is something that like people whispered. Marvin was said to be having affairs left and right. He would hook up with women he knew. He would hook up with groupies who were just into him because he was Marvin Gaye. And when he couldn't get any of those women, he would just hire sex workers. Like, he was always having his affairs. And this wasn't good for the marriage. And one of these affairs in particular is probably one of the main reasons that him and Anna ended up getting their divorce. And this is when he had an affair with a 17-year-old girl named Janice Hunter. Now, Janice was clearly underage. I'm not going to just gloss over that. She was 17 years old, and she was the daughter of the girlfriend of a producer that Marvin was working with. So one day, the girlfriend brought the daughter to like a recording session or whatever that Marvin was at, and as soon as he met the 17-year-old girl, sparks flew. Marvin said when he met Janice, she seemed like more than a real girl. She seemed like a gift from God. And Janice said that she had been in love with Marvin Gaye since she was 8 years old and had seen him on America's Bandstand, which is fucking weird. I'm gonna say it. It's so weird. It reminds me very much of Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner, because she was like in love with him from when she was a kid too. And it just seems strange. But either way, they hit it off and the affair began. After that, he divorced his wife Anna in 1973 and married Janice 4 years later, and then the two went on to have 2 children together. This was Nona and Frankie. And Janice has said that the early years were like magic, but then as time marched on and Marvin's fame grew, so did his dependence on drugs, particularly cocaine, and his behavior just became much more erratic. Like, as time went by, fame went by, affairs went by, drugs. He became a lot to handle for her. This case, Marvin Gaye's life and his death, reminded me a lot of looking into John Lennon, because I did a video on John Lennon, so I had to look into his life to do that video, which if you haven't seen it, I'll try to remember to link it. If not, you can search his name and my name and it'll come up. But the two cases reminded me of each other in that they were really disappointing to look into, because both of these men are seen and remembered even now as like symbols of peace. They were symbols and faces of a movement against hate and racism and war. Like, that is how they are seen and remembered, but they were also very troubled men, and they didn't seem to be able to extend the same sort of kindness and peace to the people in their own lives. And it's just like they say, don't meet your heroes, because like it's really hard, and I don't really like looking into these particular types of cases and these troubled men, because you see darkness in them, and it's something that I can't just like gloss over and be like, yeah, they were great, because there's going to be a shit ton of people, and me even, that are like, but they did some fucked up stuff, you know what I mean? So I just needed to say that before I move on to like some fucked up stuff he did. As Marvin Gaye's addiction became more and more intense, he became abusive in many ways. first verbally complaining about the changes to Janice's body after having his children, and he became physically abusive and sexually abusive. And I'm not going to get into all the details of the sexual abuse, but he was known to be a sexual deviant who would encourage or force his partners to do things that they may not be comfortable with. Like, for example, forcing Janice to have a threesome with another couple while he watched, and then berating her about it afterwards. And as far as the physical abuse goes, we know that on at least one occasion, he threatened to kill her. He, held a kitchen knife to her throat and told her that he loved her too much, and that his love for her was killing him, and then begged her to provoke him so that he could put both of them out of their miseries. She said of this moment, quote, "I was petrified, paralyzed. I thought it was all over." And that's fucking horrible. Okay, it's terrible. And he, at this time, was clearly spiraling, and he was suicidal shortly after this, right around this time. He tried to take his own life. He took a bunch of drugs and tried to overdose while in Hawaii. And it's just clear that he was going through a lot, and it wasn't, good. He wasn't expressing himself well, and he wasn't doing nice things. And suffice it to say, the marriage didn't last long. They were only married a couple of years before Marvin and Janice too got a divorce. So that's what's going on in his personal life. But then in his professional life, he is putting out bangers and making money like he's never seen before. He was inarguably one of Motown Records' best and brightest, and helped establish their sound in the 60s before, other famous musicians of that time, the Beatles, for example. He moved more into singing about things that really mattered. He had something to say about social justice issues, and he said them through his music going into the 70s. His iconic song, "What's Going On," remains one of the most pivotal protest songs ever written, and he wrote this in protest to the Vietnam War and also a bunch of race riots that he saw happening around the country around the time that he wrote it. And I would venture to argue that it's one of the best songs ever written, and I feel like you may disagree with that. And to anybody who does disagree with it, I would just like to quote the movie When Harry Met Sally and say, everyone thinks they have good taste and a good sense of humor, but not everybody can have good taste. Which, by the way, also, he was nominated for a Grammy for this song and actually didn't win, which surprised me. I don't understand, but okay. Now, if What's Going On isn't quite doing it for you, I think it's safe to say that all of us have probably reenacted that scene from Stepmom and sang the song Ain't No Mountain High Enough into our hairbrushes with our loved ones. At least I would like to guess that we've all done that. I don't actually know your life, so maybe you haven't, but those are just two really good songs, is my point. But despite putting out those bangers, as I said, he had a lot of issues. And when I was researching for this case, I came upon a quote about Marvin that really spoke to me. This quote said in part that Marvin Gaye was a man who chased away the demons of millions with his heavenly sound and divine art, but he himself was chased by demons of his own throughout his life, and one of those demons was his own father. With that, we're going to go back to Marvin Sr., a man who really seemed to hold himself to a very high standard. He held himself to high regard, and he was very jealous of his son's success because he felt he was the one who had the right to be like a voice for people, you know? He really thought he had more important things to say. So to see his son, who he saw as living an ungodly life, be given center stage made him resentful. Marvin, over the course of his recording career, had become the voice his father wished to be. He was more successful, he made more money, and people were running to Marvin Jr. for help and not his father, and this really, really upset Marvin Sr. But despite all this, Marvin Jr. still really wanted to please his father, to, quote, treat him honorably. So he would do all kinds of stuff for him. He would, get him tickets to go to his shows. He would spend money on him. He'd buy him cars. He bought that house so that his mother and his father could live in it together. He made sure to take care of his mother and his father. Marvin Gaye was said to be a sensitive soul and didn't understand why his father didn't acknowledge him, witness him. He just wanted to be loved by him. But he never was, and then instead, he was murdered by him. So here's what happened. Marvin Gaye Jr., had been doing poorly for a while. He had slipped a lot deeper into drugs and depression. Now he had been married twice. He had been divorced twice. And since he had children with both of these women, he also had to pay them money for his children, who they are raising. And he wasn't doing well financially at this time, which always blows my mind when people get I was just talking about this yesterday, when people get very rich, have all this money, and somehow lose it all. Because when I tell you, I have been poor always and somehow never broke. You know what I mean? I've always made it work. I do not know how people get in these positions, but this is what was going on with him. In addition to that, he owed money to the man. Apparently he owed like $6 million to the government, and he, like, as a rule, as a principle, was pretty anti-government and particularly anti-taxes. And this because when he was growing up, he felt like he didn't get the help he needed. His family didn't get the help they needed from governmental assistance and things like that when he was younger. And he believed this was due in part to his family being black. So, needing money, he went on tour for a while. He made some money. He got into a better financial place. And then he dipped. He left the country as a tax exile. And this ended up actually being good for him personally because while he was out of the country, away somewhere else, he ended up being able to get into a treatment center, and he was able to kick the cocaine habit for a bit. And then while he was there, he started making music again. And then he ended up releasing this song. It's called Sexual Healing. It's pretty obscure. You probably haven't heard of it. Just kidding. It was a bop, as the kids say, and this song actually ended up winning him his first Grammy. So he came back to the States and he did a big tour and made a ton of money. But here's the thing. In returning to the US and returning to the music scene and returning to the touring scene, he also started using cocaine again. And this time it got really bad. He got very paranoid. He started hiring extra security and even started wearing bulletproof vests on stage because he was convinced he was going to die, that he was going to be poisoned or he was going to be shot dead. And now this brings us to his father. A few months prior to his murder, Marvin moved into the home in Los Angeles that he had bought for his mother and his father. He was, struggling with drugs, struggling with depression, back in debt. And it really just shows how the mighty can fall, because this was not very long after his Grammy win, and all of a sudden he's in this position again. On top of his struggling, his mother Alberta had actually just had surgery, so he was also moving in to help her because he knew his mother couldn't depend on her husband, Marvin Sr., to help her in this time of recovery. At this time, Marvin Sr. and Alberta were not good. They were not even really in a relationship anymore. They were living in the same house, but they weren't together. They didn't have any kids to bind them to each other anymore. They weren't even sleeping in the same bed. They were just staying in the same house, which was a household that Marvin Gaye Jr. supported financially. So Marvin Jr. is back in this home and he is not doing well. He is really, really deep in the drugs. He's hiring sex workers all the time, things that he can't really afford. And he is just getting bad. He's getting paranoid. He's looking out the windows a lot. He's talking about how someone's out to get him or talking about taking his own life. And his mother is desperate. She's trying to convince him to get back into a program, but she's unsuccessful in getting him to help himself. And it got so bad that he had even tried to take his own life by jumping out of a moving car. So here he was with this sort of mental state, living in a home with his mother and father who are not getting along. And he is not getting along with his father either. Apparently it was so bad that when he first moved in, his sister was actually living in the home as well. But once Marvin moved in and he and his father started to butt heads, she actually moved out to get away from the hostility. Now, it wasn't just Marvin Sr. and Marvin Jr. who were fighting at this time. Apparently in the days leading up to the murder, Marvin Sr. and Alberta were really going at it too, and they were doing this in front of their son. And then it all came to a head on April 1st, 1984, one day shy of Marvin's 45th birthday, when Marvin Sr. started yelling at Alberta over some lost insurance policy letter. Around 12:30 p.m. that day, an irritated Marvin Sr. started yelling towards Alberta, asking her about this insurance letter. And at the time that it happened, Alberta was actually in Marvin Jr.'s room, and the two were hanging out when they heard him yell. And Marvin Jr. got irritated at the fact that he was yelling at his mother, and he's like, listen, he yelled back, listen, if you have something to say to my mother, come and talk to her face. Stop yelling at her from a distance. Apparently at this, Marvin Sr. refused to come up and talk to Alberta face to face. So Marvin Jr. was that's right. You better stay out of my room. And in response, Marvin Sr. was okay then, and marched, I believe, upstairs to Marvin's room, screaming at Alberta the whole time. In response to this, Marvin Jr., who had been laying in his bed, he jumped up. he was pissed because of how his father was talking to his mother, and he got into his face and was like, "You better not talk to my mother like that, and you need to get out of my room." And from there, a fight began. Marvin Sr. refused to leave. This pissed Marvin Jr. off. They had a lot of built-up resentment, and the fight broke out. And Alberta said of this fight, quote, "Marvin hit him. I shouted for him to stop, but he paid no attention to me. He gave my husband some hard kicks." This fight was long awaited, and Marvin Jr. went off. He punched his father over and over in the face. The fight was hot, it was heavy, but it didn't last long because his father, Marvin Sr., escalated so quickly. So the two stopped fighting. They stopped fighting, and Marvin Sr. actually left the room, leaving just Marvin Jr. and Alberta alone in the room. And then Alberta started trying to calm down her son. He sat down on the bed, and she was trying to calm him down. And all of a sudden, Marvin Sr. reappeared in the doorway, and now he was holding a .38 caliber revolver. This gun actually belonged to Marvin Jr. He had brought it to the home when he moved back in, but when he was having a really paranoid state and was, thinking of hurting himself, he gave his dad this gun to hold so that he wouldn't do that. And now his father walked up to him with that .38 caliber revolver, and he shot him. He was sitting on the bed. His father shot him once, and that shot was fatal because, as I told you in the beginning, I went through a shit ton of organs. And then he slid from the bed onto the floor, and his father walked up to him and shot him a second time at point blank range. Alberta saw all of this, right? It was very intense for her. She said her husband just walked in and didn't say anything. He just lifted the gun, and she screamed, and then he shot her son, and then her son screamed, and then her husband just walked up and shot him again. And she said at this time she just freaked out and she ran out of the room because she thought that she was going to be next. She thought that he was just going to kill them all. And what's really sad is that even though the first shot was fatal, it didn't kill him right away. He didn't die immediately. He actually lived long enough to get out some final words. So apparently his brother Frankie lived on the property. There was another house on the property, and he had actually heard the gunshots and at first thought it was like a car backfiring. But then he heard the screams, so he ran over. And when he got there, he saw his brother, and he was holding his brother in his lap when his brother said his last words. And he says that his brother's last words were, quote, "I got what I wanted. I couldn't do it myself, so I made him do it." The police then arrived to find Marvin Sr. sitting on the porch, I guess just waiting for them to arrive. He was super calm, and when they went in the house, they found that the gun that was used in the murder was hidden under his pillow. Now, Marvin Sr. was arrested, and he pled not guilty to all of his charges, saying his defense was going to be self-defense. His defense was going to be self-defense. Yes, cool. Basically, he said that he was afraid of his son, who was bigger than him, stronger than him, and also strung out on drugs. He said that he was worried he was going to be hurt or he was going to be killed. So that was his whole explanation for what happened. Now, he was held and he was given bail, but his wife, Alberta, posted his bail, so he was released. Now, Alberta said that her husband was chilling when she picked him up from the jail. She said of this, quote, "He started speaking to me but said nothing about Marvin. His eyes were dry. He wasn't apologetic or repentant. He acted like somebody who had finally gotten something out of the way." But Marvin Sr. says that that's not true, essentially, that he regretted what he did immediately. He said that when he shot Marvin, he walked out of the room and he assumed that he was fine, which is still crazy to me. But he says that he only knew something was wrong when Alberta came in and was like, "Oh my God, our son is bleeding." And he says he went in, he saw that Marvin was in fact bleeding and told her, call the police. He said of his feelings, quote, "I fear God. I respect God. I'm sorry and I regret what happened to this moment." Now, after being released from jail, Marvin Sr. actually went back to the house where he had murdered his son. But Alberta didn't. She said that she could never see herself setting foot in that home again. She said that that place to her was essentially just a tomb. Right after he was released, Alberta also tried to get a divorce from her husband, but I'm not sure exactly what happened, but they didn't end up getting divorced. She just settled for them being separated. Yeah. But essentially she left, she moved out, she did her own thing, and she completely broke off from her husband. This really seemed to upset Marvin Sr., his wife leaving, and I guess his kids didn't really come to see him either. And he did do an interview at one point, and he said of this, quote, "If you see my wife, tell her I'm hurt, and I want to see her so bad. All of my children. I don't know if they've turned against me or what. But they were hurt, you know what I mean? I can't imagine being in that position, but they all just kind of had to deal with it in their own way. Alberta just straight up dipped, left him, and was no longer going to have a relationship, but that relationship sounded like it was pretty much over from the start, to be honest. His son, Marvin Jr.'s brother, Frankie, left to London. He needed to get as far away from the situation as possible, and this left Marvin's sister, Zeola, to be like the one person there, the person who was the representative, the speaker for the family. And she said that like their family was irreparably damaged, and said that her mother never got over this. And even his grandkids, at least his granddaughter, was totally done with him. She was only 10 years old, and she decided that she was going to start calling him Mr. Gay. It wasn't that she hated him. She didn't have hate for him, but she didn't want a relationship with him, and she didn't want to show him any love anymore. A memorial service was held for Marvin Gaye in the Hollywood Hills, and there were so many people in attendance. Smokey Robinson, you know, Brian Howard's favorite musician, along with Stevie Wonder, both gave eulogies at the service. And Stevie Wonder, who said Marvin really encouraged him to make the music within him, also wrote a song for the occasion called Lighting Up the Candles. It's just all very sad, but let's move to the legal part of this. So Marvin Sr., he says, you know, yes, I shot him, but it was in self-defense. I was trying to protect myself. I wanted to stop him from beating me, which was weird considering like the fight had stopped, right? Marvin had stopped beating him. He had left the room, then went, got a gun, returned, and shot him. He says that his son was very violent, very aggressive, that his son threw him to the floor and kicked him all over his body. He said he kicked him anywhere he could kick. But some cops that were there, contradicted this, saying that there was no evidence that a beating that brutal had taken place. And they said specifically, quote, there was no indication of bruises on his head, nothing like he'd been punched out or that kind of stuff. But that's what he said. That's what he said happened. He said that when he got the gun and he shot his son, he didn't realize that he had hurt him as bad as he had because he believed that this gun was loaded with BBs or with blanks. He says when he shot his son, the first bullet didn't seem to faze him at all. He says that his son just looked at him like perhaps he had been shot with a BB. So he shot again. He says he was backing out of the room when he fired the second shot, and that his plan was to just leave the room and go lock himself in his own room. Now, this is wild, and I honestly, when I look at this, I cannot understand why this happened, but Marvin Sr. was given a plea deal. He ended up pleading no contest to voluntary manslaughter, and at 70 years old, he was given a 6-year suspended sentence and just 5 years probation. Apparently, there were a couple of factors that made them come to this decision. The first was that Marvin Sr. was in failing health. I guess before the trial started, he actually had surgery because they discovered that there was a brain tumor on his brain. Brain tumor, you get it? And so he was in terrible health. And on top of that, they considered that Marvin Jr. was the aggressor. I guess the defense and the prosecution, both agreed that because of his age and his failing health, both are kind of the same. Because of his age and how sick he was, he did not present a threat to the society. This is a good sentence. Basically, they're like, he's old as hell, he's sick as hell, he's not going to hurt anyone else, and plus, Marvin kind of started it. This is the vibe that I got. Marvin Sr. tearfully apologized to the court, saying, quote, if I could bring him back, I would. I was afraid of him. I thought I was going to get hurt. I don't know what was going to happen. I'm really sorry for everything that happened. I loved him. I wish he could step through this door right now. I'm paying the price now. Paying the price. Well, you get to go home free on a suspended sentence, and your son is dead in the ground. Okay. Now, Marvin Sr. did not take advantage of his freedom. He apparently, really fell hard into the bottle after he was released, with Alberta saying that he was drinking, a fifth of vodka a day, which is just, that's a lot of vodka. And then he ended up dying alone in a nursing home on October 10th, 1998, and this was just a little more than a week after his 84th birthday. Marvin Gaye's death affected so many people. He was so beloved that he was even inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987, and his memory has inspired so many musical tributes over the years, with many people mentioning him in his songs. People who respected him and remembered him and wanted him to be remembered through their music. But of course, the people that were most affected by his murder were his family. Janice, his ex-wife, says that she will never forget him and that she remembers him with love whenever she looks into her kids' faces. She says that through them, she's able to see Marvin every day. And it was his kids, the people who loved him most, those who really carried on his legacy, that were the ones to spread his ashes over the Pacific Ocean once he was cremated. And with that, my friends, is the story of the murder of the Prince of Soul, Marvin Gaye. I hope you found this video to be informative and it made sense, and of course, I just want to thank you for remembering Marvin with me today. Now, considering everything I told you throughout this video, I want to revisit the question of the day, and that was this. Do you believe that Marvin Gaye instigated the fight with his father in a sort of assisted suicide situation? There are a lot of people out there who believe that Marvin Gaye wanted to die that day and that he wanted his father specifically to be the person who killed him so that his father would be burdened with the guilt for the rest of his life. So that's a lot, and I'm very curious what you think. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. Before you leave, please don't forget to leave me a case suggestion down below. As you know, I have a long list of cases, and whenever you leave a suggestion, I put your name next to it, so if I cover it, I can give you a shout out. I love looking into the cases you guys suggest because they're often cases that I haven't heard of or cases that need more coverage, and I know you're filled with good ideas and good taste, otherwise you would not be here. If you haven't already, please don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week like this week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. And if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media is listed down below, along with a link to my membership where you can get early access to non-sponsored videos, priority comment responses, things like that. I want to say one last thank you to Aura for partnering with me on today's video. It's sponsors like Aura that make it possible for me to put out videos as consistently as I do. And a big thank you to you guys for always being so supportive of all of my sponsors. You rock. Don't ever change. And now with all of that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.